Hello, everyone. Welcome to Commie Reading Group. Today we'll be starting Chapter 3 of Capital's Grave by Jodi. Chapter 3 is Neo-Feudalism's Basic Features. So let's get started. Neo-feudalism isn't a concept reliant on a detailed history of actual existing feudalism. It is a vision of where capitalism is heading. It relies on contemporary analysis of law, social property relations, spatiality, and effect on seeing how developments that have previously been considered separate are in fact deeply interconnected. This chapter describes the primary features of neo-feudalism in terms of these four categories, highlighting parcellating sovereignty, new lords and serfs, hinterlandism, and catastrophic anxiety. Hello, Alex Jones was right. Thank you for the follow. Interesting name. The chapter begins with a sketch of the changes in state form accompanying the neoliberalism assault on the welfare state and enabling the political emergence of neo-feudalism. The last 40 years of neoliberalism have unraveled the sovereignty associated first with the monarchies of early European modernity, and then with the people in bourgeoisie democracies. Almost as if history were running backwards, sovereignty is becoming serenity. Suzerainty, I mean. Sorry. States exist as governments over people and territory, yet they lack the ability to act independently. Like so many oath-bound vassals, their range of movement is curtailed by mired treaties and agreements, by the preferences of investors and asset holders, by the dominance of imperial powers, and by their own self-fragmentation. As the few have been able to exercise economic power as political power, the many have been pushed into servitude, unable to avoid ever-raising fees, fines, rents, and penalties. Greg, how you doing? Welcome in. Not only have the people lost the fantasy of sovereignty, they've lost what little freedom popular struggle attended. From sovereignty to suzerainty. Although always more complicated in actual practice, economic liberalism relied on the idea of free people and free markets. With a constitutional state securing rights to property and upholding fair contracts, the hardworking and resourceful could make their fortune and benefit society. Their productive investment would provide employment for the many, keeping workers in their place while rewarding the industrious. Relations in the factory may have been despotic, but the consent of contract was that they were freely chosen. Society may have been competitive, even somewhat anarchic, but bourgeoisie's constitutional law supplied the minimal conditions necessary for the self-governed of free men. Even if it was never realized in practice, this was the story that the liberal democratic state used to legitimate itself, and the capitalist mode of production is protected. The Fordist welfare state changes this story. The state might claim to be liberal and democratic, but its legitimacy doesn't stem from securing rights and liberties. It stems from its ability to maintain the conditions necessary for capital accumulation. As Antonio Negri argues, the welfare state society's exploitation, exercising despotism throughout society on capital's behalf. Hi Crimson, how you doing? Welcome in. Society becomes a social factory, functioning as what Marx would call an abstract capitalist. The state recognizes its dependence on the working class. The working class can't be eliminated. Capital accumulation requires it. But the working class is dangerous, an ever-present threat to an always uncertain and risky future. From the perspective of capitalists, workers are the party of catastrophe. The repercussions of the state's direct involvement in securing the reproduction of capitalism is that, as Negri puts it, the settling of accounts with the party of catastrophe becomes a daily event. The Fordist era presents the incorporation of the working class in the capitalist state in terms of class compromise, reformism, and the common good. Hell yeah, I hope your labs are going good. The reality was that capital is becoming the state opened it to contestation and contradiction. The state represents to the precarity of capital's position. Precarity of capital's position to the difficulty of securing equilibrium. With force, repression, and violence. Economic problems are immediately political. The struggles associated with this settling of accounts intensifies during the revolutionary period of 1968. Women workers, students, black people, brown people, colonized people, indigenous people, people against war, people against sexual oppression, and people against the suffocating despotism of the social factory claiming the liberties promised by democracy. Capital responded with neoliberal globalization, paying for the restoration of capitalist power by surrendering features previously reserved to sovereignty. If sovereignty was the organized power of the people, if the concerns and interests of the working class could not be excluded from it, then sovereignty itself would have to go. It would have to be limited, shared, unrevealed. Neoliberalism was the ideological and policy apprentice for this unraveling. It undermined sovereignty, which in no way means that it conserve, eroded state power. Finance capital subjected states to markets. Operating outside of the traditional structures of bourgeoisie representative government, the demands of investors and financiers decrease the political effectiveness of law and elections. Just as the state came to function as a collective capitalist in charge of the socialist factory under Fordism, so did it come to serve the needs of finance capital. Recognizing the global division of labor, appropriating profit, and extracting rent from the production and reproduction of life, and from the communication and circulation of value. Quinn Slobodin recounts the development of the neoliberal strategy of undermining the economic authority of the nation state in the interest of advancing global trade. Threatened by the organized demands coming from the newly independent nations of the global south from reparations, sovereignty over their own national resources, stabilized commodity prices, and the regularization of transnational corporations. Neoliberals in the 1970s sought to circumvent the authority of national governments. They advocated a multi-level approach to regulation, a competitive feudalism that would enable capital to discipline governments while itself remaining immunized from democratic control. In the words of Hans Wilgerdot, one of the neoliberal Slobodin studies, the new competitive feudalism requires the state to share its sovereignty downward with feudal structures and bind itself upward with an international legal community. This global legal architecture fragments sovereignty. It's as if neoliberalism is in the vanishing mediator that, intended to protect capitalism, creates the conditions for its demise, for its evolution into a form of accumulation and control that can no longer be understood in terms of a capitalist system separated by public and private, state and market, corrosion and consent. Son. I don't know that word. I'm sorry, comrades. Neoliberalism reformulation of power from transcendental. Can one of you ban that bot, please? Thank you. Neoliberalism's reformulation of power from transcendental state command to emanate global control does not expand the social factor to the global level. The logic and mechanisms of control aren't exercised from above. They're exercised across and through, and unevenly and transversely. There isn't a centralized world power or one world government. There's a multi-layered patchwork of crisis-crossing arguments and treaties designed to benefit the powerful and to subject and contain the weak. Negri pinpoints the structural obstacle sovereignty encounters under neoliberalism as the uncertain relationship between exponential, exponentially and precariousness. Exponentiality has lost the transcendental status attributed to it by Carl Schmitt, because intimate in the need for daily decisions amid the precariousness of the judicial fabric. By moving to the global left, the global level, I mean, capital, or more precisely, monopoly holders of assets and hoarders of wealth frees itself from state-imposed constrictions, constraints. I mean, tax rate too high. Incorporate the Cayman Islands. Burdened by high labor costs. Build or find a factory in an enterprise zone. Maybe even one that subsidizes labor cost. Worried about being sued by employees, customers, or clients? Proactively demand ad- arbitration arguments where contractual terms take the place of state law. What might have one been recognizable as corruption has become woven into legality, and an instance where an overburdened state can enforce some kind of oversight. Billionaires or large corporations write off their fines and penalties as the cost of doing business. Neoliberalism's unraveling of sovereignty dismantles the social factory, much as leveraged buyouts enable financiers to buy up companies, saddle them with their debt that funded their purchases, sell off their assets, and fire their employees, perhaps hiring them back as benefitless temp workers and consultants. The social factory, like the factory, was never merely despotic. Both point to productive relations between capital and labor, relations of exploitation within which labor, when unionized, has the leverage to exact conscience. Organized workers have the some ability to shape the conditions of their exploitation, and ability independent contractors and workers in enterprise zones lack. This ability to extract consciences, concessions, is true for the social factory as well. That democracy was the ideological form of exploitation, placed conditions and expectations on the exploitation. Sovereignty wasn't just the sovereignty of the state. In this ideological form, it was sovereignty over the people. With productive relations between capital and labor now subjected to expropriative relations of rent and service, the capacity to shape the conditions of life and work has dramatically diminished. Submission is the cost of doing business in a loose and unstable system of unequal and competing suzerainities. The post-Fordist transformation in sovereignty is accompanied by a new premise of violence. N- Nigari associates this violence with the emergence of the primitive accumulation model, the extraction rather than the production of value. Okay, sounds good. I'll pin that. Finance itself functions extractly, enabling extreme contradictions of private assets. Here, Negri's analysis aligns with Robert Brenner's account of the political driven upward redistribution of wealth. Instead of rearranging production and implementing technical improvements to increase productivity, what Marx referred to as real substantiation and capital accumulation takes place under conditions of formal substantiation. Non-capitalist processes produce value that capital, whatever value measures of finance or governance, simply takes. Examples of reassurance formal substantiation are Uber and Airbnb. Uber and Airbnb. Wow, I'm struggling a little bit tonight, comrades. Neither improved labor productivity or created new effectiveness in the provision of local transportation or lodging. Both rely on the fixed capital of earners rather than on capitalists who invest in the means of production. Both turn assets acquired out of workers' consumption funds, their cars and houses, into means for the capital accumulation of another, the platform owner, as I detailed in chapter 1. Negri's rightfully draws out the extractive nature of capital accumulation under global financialization, but he also claims that today's exploitation no longer contains a contractual model. It's more accurate to say that the function of the contract has shifted. It has shed the presence of a contract between equals for an exchange of equivalence to become a means for intensified exploitation without the productive cover of public law. As Alan Subpope demonstrates, contractualization is a feature of a society of networks, deeply embedded in the technologies whereby people are infeudalized today. Contemporary contracts lock people into fulfilling objectives rather than observing rules. Instead of functioning in terms of a law that obliges parties to do or refrain from doing something specific, contracts in networked society create a bond which obliges one party to behave according to the expectations of another. When expectations aren't met, corrective mechanisms may be automatically triggered. For subpoet, the shift from law to bond illustrates the way people come to be, placed in a network or relations of dependence. He explains, the guiding idea is not that all should be subject to the same abstract law, but that each people should behave in accordance with his or her place in the network. Each must do his best to serve the interest of those on whom he depends and be able to count on the loyalty of those who are dependent on him. People's legal status in their mutual relations and their relations to things is defined, not subordination to the same impersonal law, by the personal ties. Relational contracts bind people to the service of another in a contemporary version of vassalage. In its Western European form, vassalage was a legal contract through which one person is made dependent on another, as in homage or serfdom. This personal dimen- dimension of the bond was accumulated by a real or material dimension. The possession granted to the dependent. Such possessions was always burdened with obligations, requirements of service to the other party. What the services entailed was determined by status. A serf might be required to perform agriculture labor, while acts of loyalty service would be expected of a vassal. Yo, Squishmallow, thank you for subscribing. Welcome in. Subput sees an extension of vassalage in the contemporary shift from sovereignty to suzerainty. He writes, the suzerain has immediate authority over his vassals, but not his vassals. Vassals whereas the sovereign's power is supreme self, positioning and bears its cause within itself, and can be exercised directly over his subjects. I don't know who you're talking about. KHPN. Subpot's examples of contemporary suzerainty are in the European Union and International Monetary Fund. Neither the EU nor its member states are sovereign. Member states are in the position of vassals. With no direct authority over populations, the EU depends on the mediation of the member states. States swear allegiance to the IMF. Subjecting themselves to carry out its requirements. Despite the hopes and dreams of many an anarchist, the end of sovereignty it's not a story of liberation. The unraveling of the state under conditions of capitalism becomes neo-feudal is a story of the loss of the universal amid fragmentation and privatization. Neoliberal policies amid aiming to shield capital, property, and markets from popular power open up new opportunities for private power to exert itself. Nesting feud fiefdoms and relations of vassalage sit within flows of conflict and alliance. Armed empires and private militaries algorithmically manage service and servitude. State powers take the form of suzerainty, and the social factory becomes a social manor. This is the background against which I now turn to the basic features of neo-feudalism. Parasited sovereignty. Perry Anderson categorizes the feudal mode of production in Europe in terms of the parcelization of sovereignty. Power was fragmented into multiple and shifting local configuration and conditional nesting relationships of vassalage, service, and alliance. Eileen Miskinswood refines the idea of parcelted sovereignty by highlighting the abstract economic curson that lords extracted over peasants through traditional, legal, and political means. Despaired lords extracted surplus from the peasants on which they depended, rather than a state collecting taxes or an employer paying wages. Lords generally took the products of a peasant labor in the forms of rents, whether there was labor rents, money rents, or some combination thereof. Lords' relations to peasants were both legal and economic, combining the private exploitation of labor with the public role of administration, jurisdiction, and enforcement. This public role was not determined by generally applicable public laws. It was up to the lords to administer, judge, and enforce as they choose. Because lordship involved a personal relation to peasants and property. Contracts we may be accustomed to thinking of in terms of law, in fact, should be understood as taking the form of bonds. Disputes would be addressed by attribution and compromise, determined by status and the specifics of a situation rather than by general legal norms. Not surprisingly, the line between legal and illegal was indistinct. These two aspects of parcellated sovereignty, fragmentation, and extra economic coercion, appears in contemporary neo-feudalism. As various scholars have observed, fragmentation over as private commercial interest displace public law. Chira Cordelli argues that the impact of neoliberalism has been a renewed feudal order within which political power is increased exercised on the basis of privately negotiated obligations, non-public purposes, and ultimately unilateral determinations. Sabiedin describes the myriad hybrid political and economic forms through which capital seeks to escape regulation. Free ports, duty-free districts, city-states, gated communities, tax havens, innovation hubs, cryptocurrencies, in a dizzying array of zones. The most familiar became being special economic zones and export processing zones. Robert Kuttner and Catherine Stone find that confidentiality agreements, non-competitive, non-compete rules, compulsory apparition, the dismantling of public regularity, regulatory agents, and the undermining of public education via vouchers and charter schools are all exemplify what the legal sanctioned private JERA produced neo-feudalism. Jerry's Prudence neo-feudalism gives private entities power previously exercised by the state. With the parcelization of sovereignty, political authority and economic power blend together. The legal fictions of a bourgeoisie state, determined by the forms of neutral law and free and equal individuals, break down, and the direct political character of society reasserts itself. Political power is exercised with and as economic power, not states but tolls, fines, liens, asset seizures, license, patents, jurisdictions, sanctions, and borders. The blurring of the political and economic renders any political claim immediately self-interest and suspect, and instantation of power, privilege, and bias. The undermining of workers' rights due to the rise of compulsory abolition is a particularly powerful example of the impact of neo-feudalization on everyday life. Over 55% of U.S. workers are subject to mandatory abolition agreements. As a condition of employment, workers are made to sign an agreement that they will submit to abolition in the event of a workplace dispute. For the sake of a job, they are compelled to give up their legal right to have their grievances adjudicated in a public court of law. This includes the right to engage in a class action dispute, that is, a collective action regarding workplace and employment practices. Arbitration agreements are not confined to high income, deeply specialized, or creative occupations. On the contrary, industries with large numbers of low-wage workers are the ones with most frequently subjecting works to mandatory arbitration agreements. In other words, industries whose workers are most dependent on their jobs for survival and least able to find other work. As in the feudal arrangement, so in the neo-feudal do private economic actors exercise political power, the power to adjudicate disputes over a particular group of people on the basis of terms and conditions that they, the private economic actors, set. In the same vein, foreign investors have the right to sue state governments in an internal tribunals. The investor-state dispute settlement, the ISDS system, allows foreign investors to sidestep domestic law and bring a claim against a country they've invested in if they think that country has violated the terms set out in specific bilateral investment treaties, BITs, or regional trade agreements, RTAs. The typical suit involves a corporation invoking ISDS if a state passes public interest regulations designed to protect water, communities, or environment. In suits against Latin America governments, Canadian mining exploration firms have brought a large number of such cases to arbitration tribunals. According to Manuel Prezes Roca and Jean Moore, the tribunal members are highly paid corporate lawyers who have no obligation to consider the rights of local communities or the importance of health and environmental protections. The disputes are settled via arbitration agreements that tend to be highly arbitrary, opaque, not open to public scrutiny, and generally pro-investor in their judgments. The implications of the African Free Trade Agreement in 2021 occasions the proliferation of arbitration courts across the continent. Not only are vastly unequal countries brought into a single market that benefits from established players such as South Africa, but the laws of the 55 countries in the agreement. The only country not part of it is Eritrea, can be limited or eclipsed in arbitration. These elements of the architectural of global trade, Jayate Ghosh writes, are about protecting and promoting private investors of all types, and effectively privileging the rights of investors over the rights of citizens in the host country. Private economic power trumps public law, not only decreasing the policy options available to state, but actively dismantling even the fiction of popular sovereignty. The explosion in financial technology, fintechs, is a creepy reflexivation of neo-feudalism's patterns of blending economic and privatized social corruption, or data which we gave up unaware or under arcane users agreements over which we have no control. Gets links to our credit worthiness. Apps from securing easy credit mines users' smartphone data and track their interactions for indications of how desperate they might be for a loan and how risky that loan might be. In Kenya, fintech's predatory microlending created an epidemic of indebtedness. companies like Safara.com, one of the largest corporations in East Africa, Tela and Branch, headquartered in California, often financially strapped Kenyans small loans to help get them through the month, locking them into perpetual indebtedness with exorbitant interest rates and further impacting their credit rating. How do these private companies get away with this? According to Kevin P. Donovan and Emma Perk, it's because of their capacity to escape jurisdiction, a capacity that is both cause and effect of parcellated sovereignty. 10% of global wealth is hoarded in offshore accounts to avoid taxation, that is, to escape the reach of state law. Law doesn't apply to billionaires powerful enough to evade it. Libertarians try to gain up enthusiasm for cryptocurrencies on the bias of the capacity of blockchain and similar consciousness concessionist algorithms to circumvent state power. Correctively, the largest tech companies have valuations greater than the economies of most of the world's countries. Cities and state relate to Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google as if these corporations were themselves sovereign states, trying to attract and negate with these firms on the firm's own terms. Government's accusation of control over their political economy in the form of subsides and tax breaks, which puts them in a position where they can no longer meet basic social needs and so remain bound to private firms until the firms decide to leave. Firms exploit this dependence, using the threat of departure to extort more concessions from dependent governments, which should really no longer be seen as governments. They are managers overseeing the non-government of domination that Ramin Idris associates with feudal colonialism in the Sahel. Immense concentrated wealth has its own constitute power, the power to constitute the rules it will follow or not. Kuttner and Stone uses mortgage electronic resignation services to illustrate how the blending of economic and political power characteristics of neo-feudalism, parcellated sovereignty, effaces the distinction between law and illegal. Well, I'm screwing up a little tonight, guys. A shell company. MERS was privately a database created and owned by big banks, and purpose was avoiding the fees associated with traditional practices of registering mortgages. During the housing bubble leading up to the crisis of 2008, banks encouraged the buying and selling of mortgages so that they could combine these mortgages into securitized assets. MERS let them list just the original mortgage. When banks sold mortgages to other banks, when they did multiple times, they could list MERS as a lender. When the financial crisis hit, MERS was the source of countless problems, from database errors to unlawful mortgage transfers. Millions of people found themselves foreclosure proceedings and lost their homes based on fraudulent documents from a shell company that was at best a legal friction. A private system for designating property took over what had been a political legal domain. The result was the legal exportation of people's homes. The widespread privatization of state functions testifies to sovereign fragmentation. Privatization has been a widely discussed dimension of neo-feudalism. From the dismantling of state socialism in the former Eastern Bloc to the forcing of structural adjustment policies on the global south and the imposition of autocracy in the EU and otherwise. Security is one of the most visible domains of privatization. Already in the early 2000s, scholars in international relations and security studies were documenting the unraveling of the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. Marina Caparini identifies a polarization of security within state and transnationality. As authority is fragmented across public and private actors at local, state, and international levels. From above, state outsource military and security tasks to private commercial firms. From below, insurance, militants, gangs, and other opposition groups both challenge the state and fill in for its retreat and incapacity. That the blurring of a political authority and economic power erodes legally is widely apparent. Palestine is the most obvious example, as Israeli settlers illegally build up settlements on Palestinian land, protected by Israel's military forces. There are patterns here, as an activist slogan. From Ferguson to Palestine, occupation is a crime, announces. The dramatic expansion of misdemeanor law in the already enormous U.S. carousel system illustrates that point. Poor people, disproportionately people of color, and are arrested on bogus charges and convinced to plead guilty so as to avoid the jail time they could incur should they contest the charges. Not only the guilty plea go on their record, but they state to accrue fines that, if they can't afford to pay them, will result in more fines and more charges. The legal system itself operates as a mode of exportation. We got a brief look at this system in the wake of the 2014 riots in Ferguson, Missouri, that followed the murder of Michael Brown. The city's municipal court and policing apparatus openly extracted millions of dollars from its low-income African American population. Police were instructed to make arrests and issued citations in order to raise revenue. Like vassals of feudal lords, police forcibly expropriate surplus from the people. As the shift from sovereignty to suzerainty suggests feudal social relations are distinguished by the absence of centralized power, public power, and the intermeshing of economic and political power. In the 21st century, similar phenomena of fragmentation and political and economic blending pervade the globe. Imperialist states like the U.S. place economic sanctions on weaker states, starving, brutalizing, and killing civilian populations in a neo-feudal version of medieval siege war. As Jessica White details in a study of the devastating impact of U.S. unilateral curvice curversive curvice measures on Venezuela. International law has been ill-equipped at dealing with a form of power that blurs the lines between permitted economic competition and prohibited political coercion. Coercion. I don't know that fucking word, goddammit. She writes, by preventing countries from restricting their debts, financial sanctions put them into default, generating spiraling interest rates and capital flight. By freezing central bank funds, they deprive countries of their resources to define their currencies. And by weaponizing inflation and unemployment, they ensure that even when food and medicine is available, it is too expensive for most civilians to afford. The function of a political system anchored in the rule of law and an economic system following capitalist laws of motion gives way to networked private relations in which power and privilege reign. That was a long